welcome to another edition of Stay at Home. My name is Bhaskar Sankara. I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine. And since the start of this quarantine in March, almost every day at 6 p.m. Eastern, I've been joined by a left-wing thinker who's been laying out an argument or giving us a lecture for around a half an hour. Then we've been doing a Q&A afterwards with our live audience. So if you are watching this live, all you have to do is leave your questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We have a good lineup for the rest of the week. Tomorrow we have Leah Ippy, who will be talking about broadly the relationship between liberalism and socialism, in particular with Rawlsian thought and Rawls's theory of justice and democratic socialism. So where do even the most egalitarian of liberals fall short? And maybe what insights we can, as Marxists, as socialists, glean from this form of egalitarian liberalism. Then on Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern, we have another edition of Stay at Home with Anna Caspera and Michael Brooks. So please, if you like this material, all we're asking right now is for you to, of course, if you want, you can go to the Jacobin website and toss us a donation or something. But all we're really asking you to do at the moment is press subscribe and press like. Doing so obviously makes me and our speakers feel good about the arguments we're making. That validation is there. But more importantly, it helps us reach more people through the YouTube algorithm. We went from around 4,000 subscribers 5-6 weeks ago to now, I guess we're up near 22,000 or so. And that's been all or mostly organic growth just through the YouTube algorithm, feeding it to more people. We have a long way to go before we catch up to some of the right-wing YouTubes or even weird venues like the Epoch Times. But think of Jacobin as like an Epoch Times of the left, where instead of a weird religious cult, you get left social democracy. But today we have a future, a man that I would follow in any political organization and build a cult of personality around, Anton Jäger, who's a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge. It's a good one. And he's working on a history of populism in the United States right now. And together with longtime Jacobin contributor and friend Daniel Zamora, he's also working on an intellectual history of basic income. He wrote an excellent piece for, I believe it's a fall edition of Jacobin last year, the fall 2019 edition, called "We Bet the House on Left Populism and Lost." And he also co-wrote a more academic article for the last edition of Catalyst, and I think that was with Arthur Borriello, and that's in the latest edition of Catalyst. If it's not unpaywalled, I will unpaywall it very shortly, almost immediately after this talk. So without further ado, please press like, press subscribe, please tell your friends about these talks on social media, and go ahead, Anton.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Bhaskar, for the invitation. And thanks for inviting me to talk about populism. So as you know, it's been a particularly topical topic in the last 10 years, but fortunately or unfortunately, I also think it's one of the most important topics, and investigating it will give us a kind of golden road to understanding global politics in the last decade. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with a quick overview of what types of themes and topics I'm going to cover, just to give you a sense of the broader argument being laid out and where exactly I'm headed politically with that argument. So in general, I want to talk about four main things. Firstly, what populism is. I'll give a current overview of theories of populism, why some might be preferable to others. Now, secondly, I really want to talk about left populism in specific, and I'll outline two stimuli for this original left populism in the last 10 years, which are one, the decline of party democracy in Europe in the last 30 or 20 years, and then the 2008 financial crash, and mainly how that 2008 financial crash was negotiated politically. Then the third thing I want to talk about is the strengths and weaknesses of this original left populist strategy. So in what sense did it succeed and in what sense did it fail? And finally, fourthly, I want to close with a question of where you might go from here transitioning out of left populism into a different world, certainly a world which is completely being rocked by this COVID crisis and in which political dividing lines are being reshuffled very, very quickly. Now, to start off, just for the pertinence of populism, I kind of think the statistics speak for themselves. So in English, for example, you have over 500 academic publications that have appeared on populism in the past year. Newspapers like The Guardian are still running special series on it. And you also have a journal exclusively dedicated topic, I think, which was launched in 2017, just titled Populism. The Cambridge Dictionary also proclaimed populism the word of the year in 2017. Now, as you can see in this graph, there's an indication just how rapid the rise in popularity is of the term, mainly over the last 20 years. Now, what's happening, of course, is that this sprawling literature is tracking a far deeper trend. It's not just an academic fad or a journalistic obsession. What you see globally is that there have been new movements who claim to speak on behalf of the people, who have won majorities. Some of them have ousted incumbents, some of them have attacked courts, and some of them have even locked up their opponents. Now, when we listen to these stories, we can see a kind of diffuse definition of populism, which is both actor and symptom, but it's also the expression of a very deep structural crisis which is rolling across global democracies. And when we discuss this crisis, we see a very wide range of different political actors that are usually compressed into the term populism for this occasion. We can talk about Pablo Iglesias from Podemos in Spain. We can also talk about Donald Trump in the US. We can talk about Marine Le Pen in France from the Front National. You have Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage in the UK. You have someone like Beppe Grillo in Italy. And these are but some of the politicians who really qualify for this label. Now, we just have to start with a very basic terminological question, namely, what is populism? And any political scientist you will talk to who is specializing in this subject will tell you it is an essentially contested concept. There are as many definitions as there are political scientists. But I don't think we should first ask the question, what is populism? But first, how do we use the word populism in general language? And how can we derive a definition of populism or what populism is from our usages? So I'm first going to talk about the ways in which we use that term. Now, first off is what you could call a journalistic usage of that term. And in this journalistic usage, populism is just a synonym for demagoguery, or more complexly, it's a way of calling someone a demagogue without actually saying that word out loud. Now, I don't think we have to bother with that definition too long. It's quite vulgar. It's also quite widespread in media debates. But primarily since this usage just seems to be a way of policing the borders of acceptable discourse and castigating any kind of challenge to common sense liberalism after 1989 as somehow akin to civilizational breakdown. So when I talk about populism, I'm not necessarily using the term in that pejorative sense, as it is often done in media debates, but I mean it in a much more stronger descriptive, although I wouldn't say scientific sense. So instead, I advise we should talk about the historical usage of the word populism. Now, if we go back to 1982, you had a group of radical American farmers and workers who united mainly in the South and the Midwest to form a third party, which they were going to run against Democrats and against Republicans. Now, that party was called the People's Party. And the People's Party really was the last serious third party alternative in American history, except for the Socialist Party in the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the issues this People's Party was facing in the 1890s is that they didn't have a really short, snappy name for themselves. So you knew what a member of the Democratic Party was called, a Democrat. You knew the same for a Republican Party. But eventually you didn't quite know what you were supposed to call a member of that People's Party. And eventually the word they settled on was populist. And it's then really in 1891, 1892 that we see the introduction of that term into our global political lexicon. Now, actually, for the majority of the 20th century, and I don't think too many people know this, this original American Party remained the only known referent in this word, of this word. What you have in the 1930s is that translations begin popping up in French. The 1950s, you see the term appear in Spanish and in German. But it's only really in the 1970s and 1980s, I think, when you have a flourishing field of far-right studies, mainly European academia, that begins to use the term, that it starts to gain traction also in European public debates. Now, that story, I think, is also part of the reason why some Americans still attach very different connotations to the term populism today than European ones might do. So a very famous example of this is, for example, Obama's uneasiness in calling Trump a populist, because the natural association Obama attaches to the word is that of the late 19th century Populist Party, which united both black and white sharecroppers in the American South. And he just finds it difficult to reconcile that understanding of populism with the authoritarian demeanor of someone like Donald Trump. Now, if we build on this historical understanding, I think we can also capture a more interesting definition of populism, which is available today, but it also applies to the last 30 years of European politics specifically. This is mainly thanks to an academic gold rush into the topic, which has been happening in the last 10 years. Populism studies has grown into a very rich research field. But what populism studies mainly seeks to investigate is the rise of a group of parties in the last 30, 20 years that arise next to classical mass parties as they existed in the 20th century. So Christian democratic, liberal, or socialist parties, parties that claim to speak on behalf of the people, that are polling higher in elections, that are gaining some more members, but who organizationally and politically don't quite look like those other mass parties and function in a very different way. Now, we can just start by saying what these new populist parties or this new populism is definitely not. So firstly, it is clearly not liberalism. These new populist parties do not believe in consensus or don't have the same adherence to procedures as liberals do. They also seem to believe very strongly that politics should indeed be about enemies. But at the same time, it's also not fascism. So right-wing populism, as it's often called, or as journalists would like you to believe, is not simply the same as fascism, mainly because this new populism is not intrinsically hostile to parliaments. It does not seek to crush a powerfully organized working class, mainly because there is no working class that's powerfully organized to crush. And finally, from the left, it's also not classical class politics as we know it from the socialist tradition. Also because it lacks an organized working class to work with, but mainly also because it doesn't center its political rhetoric around class that much. So rather it centers it around other dichotomies such as people versus elite. And it also doesn't see society in terms of interests or potential conflicts of interest, but rather in terms of identities and how different identities seek expression in politics or are negated by other social actors. So as you can see, obviously we have a far more comprehensive and interesting definition available here to describe the European populist parties which have arisen in the last 20 years. So in its current European context, the definition of populism, where those debates are way more fraught, we can actually say that contemporary populism is a specific political logic which only begins to work after the death of classical party democracy. So this means that populism both expresses and reshapes citizens' relationships between societies and states. This also explains that just rhetorically appeals to the people work better today because all these previous social markers of class, religion, status, sometimes even sexuality, have been eroded, have become more liquid. And they've made citizens more receptive to these new, more general categories. So populism emerges in light of the disappearance of these classical categories that structured mass politics around the 20th century. So just as a definitional issue, we can say that movements are populist if they work in this context of a declining party democracy and they deploy the concept of the people in a anti-elitist or antagonistic fashion. Now, we have to be very clear that populism in this sense is a surface phenomenon. The underlying factor that is driving populism is what you could call, or what scholars call, a lack of mediation, insofar as the disappearance of bodies that previously stood between citizen states and organized citizens' relationship to states. And so to summarize, I think there are three important dimensions to contemporary populism we need to take into account. First aspect is that populists usually use a form of rhetoric first, which invokes a people. It's not necessarily a people that's homogeneous, but they still think that people is the most important political subject in politics. Second is ideological. Populists believe that states and societies need to be ordered in such a way that the priorities or the interests of that people are kept safe. But the third difference is also organizational, insofar as populists don't have classic mass membership parties as those other parties do. They usually rely on what's called digital parties and digital outreach. Some of the parties don't even have classical membership models. And what you can see, for example, with the PVV in the Netherlands or Beppe Grilli's 5-Star Movement, they're actually just corporations who are in the names of those leaders, and they don't accept any actual members, they just accept followers. Now, if we want to focus on left populism specifically, we kind of have to tell a slightly different story. So empirically, when we ask the question, what is left populism? We can just say, well, in the last 10 years, we have seen a number of movements. Podemos was founded in 2012. France Insoumise was founded in 2016. Corbyn won the Labour leadership in 2015. Bernie had his first presidential run in 2016. And Syriza, of course, dates back to the 2000s, but really started rising as an electoral force in 2012. And all of those forces can be qualified as left populist. They arise to the left of social democratic parties, or they arise within social democratic parties. This kind of depends on the party system in which this left populist experiment is taking place. But all of them signal a very different phase of left politics after the third way, or after the third way runs into its limits. Now, I think we need to turn to a third main discussion point here, which is, where does this left populism come from? And I think we need to understand the rise of left populism on a double timeline. One is long-term, and the second one is more short-term. Now, the first long-term timeline I want to talk about is, again, that overall secular decline of party democracy in Europe. And we can gauge this decline in a variety of factors. The declining membership rates of different parties, decreasing union density, mainly in America, but also in Europe, and increased so-called abstentionism, as it's called. And abstentionism means just falling participation rates in elections. So as I see, if we're looking at these different statistics, we can see just how sensitive the fall has been, both in membership rates, both in union density, and in electoral participation. And here are some numbers, for example, specifically for social democratic parties. So the German SPD had 1 million members in 1986. It only had half of that left at the end of the 2000s. The Labour Party had nearly 700,000 in the 1986, and it went to nearly 200,000 at the beginning of the 2000s. Of course, we know it rebounded in the 2010s for a very specific set of circumstances. But then also, for example, the Dutch Socialists had 90,000 members in 1986, and they went to 57,000 at the beginning of the 2000s. So overall, you can see a general pattern of decline. Now, Peter Mayer, who's a very famous and renowned Irish political scientist, wrote a very famous book kind of explaining this process. And he called this hollowing out of European party politics as leading to a situation where parties rule the void, in which he indicated an increasing distance between citizens and their representatives. So this means, he says, that politicians are increasingly separated from a social base. They have to speculate on what might be a popular program. And this also goes hand in hand with a profound transformation in how states relate to their society. So in the time of neoliberalism, states can organize and enforce markets, but they find it very hard to organize production or intervene in the economy. And they also have no organic connection with any constituencies below. So this then, I think, to wrap up, is the first factor on which left populism really has to be understood as a response to a hard but hollow environment. So what do I mean with hard but hollow? Insofar as states are hard in that they still have capacious capacities to whatever, build prisons, they can wage wars, they can organize markets, they can build infrastructure, but they're hollow insofar as they're not actually connected to any civil society organizations from below. Now, there are two forms of politics that are really encouraged in this hard but hollow environment. And you could call it PR politics, or you could call it protest politics. And although PR politics and protest politics might seem incompatible at first sight, there's actually a very interesting degree of complementarity between them both. So PR politics means that as politicians lose their social base, they continue to rely on spin doctors or marketeers to tell them what might be a popular program, while protest politics means that the left leaves behind its presence in workplaces and doesn't organize strikes anymore to enforce its demands, but rather wants to be seen in squares and wants to be seen as publicly visible in its specific wishes. So as you can see, both PR politics and protest politics share an essential continuity in an emphasis on visibility and also on performance. It's more about the performance of what you're doing, not essentially the substance. And obviously that leads to a very thin notion of what you want to do on the level of policy, which means that a lot of tasks which governments still have to carry out are increasingly delegated to technocratic bodies. Now, this brings me to the more short-term second factor, which really explains the rise of left populism, and that is the 2008 crisis, which really is the political big bang for the variant of left populism we've been discussing, and even for the American variants in the Bernie campaign we've seen. Now, most of you will be familiar with this story, but just to wrap up, we know that 2008 starts as a banking crisis in the US, where private banks start defaulting. The fallout of this banking crisis quickly comes to Europe, though, where you have a lot of European banks, mainly in southern countries, that are heavily involved indirectly in the American market. What happens that you have a rise of private debt, which then calls forth a response from states to take on that private debt. So private debt is publicly turned into public debt. Once private debt becomes public debt, though, there is an obligation to honor your creditors. The way you honor your creditors is basically by enforcing austerity measures. And what you can see in all of these left populist cases is that the political management of the 2008 crisis massively delegitimizes social democratic parties. So there's a word for that, which is called PASOKification, which refers to the Greek party PASOK that actually decided to enforce these austerity measures, which was being imposed on it by the Eurozone. But you can see the same process for the Dutch socialists, for the Spanish socialists, PSOE, and even in a sense for the French socialists, is that they all become the enforcers of an austerity consensus, and they thereby lose most of their working class support in a sense, but they also inflict very, very heavy damages on parts of the professional classes. Now, the first real public left responses to this austerity consensus is again a form of protest politics. So what you see is you have the Indignados in Spain. You, of course, have the Occupy movement in the US, which comes after the Indignados. But even in Greece, you have the so-called Squares movement or Anagaktis Menoi, and you can see similar protest movement arising across Europe as austerity is enforced. And what you can see in the sequence of these different anti-austerity protest moments is that they all seem to be running into certain limits, certainly by 2011, 2012. It's clear that they can't really sustain the energy and that there is no real sense in how they're going to translate their demands onto the level of policy. And once these left populists realize the limits of protest politics, and they also see that the PR politics of these old social democratic parties is not going to save them either, a lot of people on the left say, maybe we should try something different. Maybe we should try something like a counter-hegemonic populist strategy. And now the natural sources, if you want to try that populist strategy, are mainly two thinkers, Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, who since the 1980s have built up a body of work that is absolutely central for what has come to be known as a populist strategy on the left. Now, to really understand where their idea of a populist strategy comes from, we need to go back to the early 1980s and debates mainly on the British left on how the socialists should respond to the threat of Thatcher. So in the early 1980s, Mouffe and Laclau were in favor of what's called post-Marxism, which basically implied that European socialists had to let go of their one-sided focus on class and instead start organizing around a set of other markers, so gender, race, nationality, or post-colonial identities. And to Americans, this is basically understandable as an equivalent to what you could call the Rainbow Coalition in the US in the 1980s, which was tried by Jesse Jackson. So the idea is there's a very strong sense that classical working class politics can't actually provide for the needs for all these divergent groups anymore. And what you still can do is, though, unite all those groups based on their identities shared by common grievances. And this is actually a precursor of what you could call identity politics in the 2000s, with the main difference being that it's less based around minorities and it's still more general, insofar as they really embrace the idea of a broad coalition and don't seek to work on a very narrow basis. And a second feature of this populist strategy that has been advocated by Laclau and Mouffe is a prevailing focus on discourse. which is an interesting tendency it shares with the media-centric politics we've become extremely used to, insofar as it accepts that politics mainly has to happen on the level of symbols, has to happen on the level of imagery. Now, as we look to the trajectory of the 2010s, we can still see that this left populist strategy has some real, it gives these left movements some really concrete gains. So Podemos starts by achieving really impressive results in European elections. Corbyn gets into power, maintains power, and then almost ousts the Tory in 2017. Bernie has a pretty impressive presidential run already in 2016. In Greece, Syriza, of course, wins the January 2015 elections and then gets into government and immediately mounts a confrontation to the Eurozone. And Mélenchon, in the 2017 presidential election, almost comes in third in the election that finally went to Emmanuel Macron. So clearly there was something about this left populist strategy that made it quite effective for the particular environment of the 2010s. Now, what we see after this initial success story, however, is if you look at it 5 years later from our vanguard point of 2020, is that now seems to be a sense of universal retreat for a lot of left populists. So if we take the temperature of left populism today, we can see how there is a slightly more sobering balance sheet. So Corbyn achieved moderate success in 2017, but of course fails quite miserably in 2019. Bernie just dropped out recently in 2020. La France Insoumise finds it very difficult to find its place within the anti-Macron coalition, doesn't really build a sustainable party, it's heavily centered around the figure of Mélenchon, doesn't know how to relate to the Gilets jaunes and to the existing union movement, while the story for something like Syriza is obviously more tragic insofar as they sell out massively and they become the enforcers of an even harsher austerity program. Now, Podemos is a kind of outlier to this story in that it does consolidate its power and goes into government in early 2020. But it does go into government at the cost of watering down parts of its original program. And it also becomes a custodian of a regenerated, slightly regenerated, we should say, socialist party, which it was originally founded to displace, which is on its lowest numbers historically, but which had to enter into a coalition Podemos mainly to avert the threat of a rising radical right. So as we can see for left populism, the balance sheet is not cataclysmic, but it's certainly not incredibly hopeful either. In a sense, this is good because it gives us some sense of distance and also some time for reflection. So I'm going to spend the rest of my talk just listing up some weaknesses and strengths of that left populist approach. So firstly, what was positive about left populism, or what were its concrete achievements? Now, I think we can enumerate a few here. And the first concrete achievement is just that for all of Europe's left populist moment is that it gave a real taste of power to a moribund left. Not just power per se, power without a name, but concrete state power. And with it comes a second development, which was that left populism definitely gave us a more intellectually developed left as well. Now, whenever I speak to people who lived through the 1990s, and I speak about the miserable defeats we've seen in the last 2 months, they say, well, Anton, you really have no sense just how bad the 1990s were. And I know things are looking pretty bleak at the moment, but you should count your losses and make it clear that we've left part of the neoliberal matrix. It's just not that any concrete battles have been won. And thirdly, one positive thing about left populism was also that it was a valuable exercise in agenda setting. Now, I don't think agenda setting should really be confused with PR or simply building media outreach, but it is true that many topics which figure very prominently on the agenda of other political parties, but also public debates, from wage stagnation to inequality to the completely irrational ordering of the Eurozone, are now very prominent, and also partly thanks to left populists. So in America, we see this in a rising support for schemes such as Medicare for All. Now, it would be preposterous to just attribute these rising numbers to left populism alone, but still there has been a sensitive impact on that front. Now, to balance this overview, I think it's fair also to say that there are some very, very strong downsides to that left populist moment. And I think you can split those downsides into two categories: ways in which left populism was too left and ways in which left populism was too populist. Now, let me start in what way I think left populism was too populist. Now, I think left populism was too populist in the first way that it accepted demobilization to a large degree and focused very heavily on media and online outreach, which led to it not really being able to relate to surviving working class institutions, something you saw clearly in Podemos's relationship to the union movement or François Insoumise's relationship to the French unions. But it also made it hostage to the whims of a media class, which often has incentives for specific themes. And secondly, and this is a second sense in which left populism was too populist, it also really it did not rebuild shop floor institutions, and left populists had no real social power at their disposal, consequently. This is very acute for someone like Syriza, who was elected on the promise to actually stop an austerity program, but which in the end called a referendum, called on people to reject the memorandum, but couldn't actually gather the right institutional support to force a different settlement on its German creditors or to wage an actual departure from the Eurozone. Now, finally, I want to highlight one thing in which left populism, I think, was too left, is that left populism was also too left insofar as it was not completely open to parts of the electorate which were prone to risk-taking and de-alignment. The classical example of this is Corbyn's relationship to the Brexit vote, which showed that there were people who were willing to go for a redistributive agenda, but which had very specific demands on sovereignty, who were able to diverge from classical Tory voters on that front. And because Corbynism was such a London-centric movement and was mainly beholden to the cultural preferences of that London crowd, it found it immensely difficult to recognize just how profound pro-Brexit feeling was in its northern working classes. Now, I just want to finish with, I wouldn't call it practical advice, but at least some warnings on why we might go from here. I think there are two pieces of immediate advice we can give. The first talk is, of course, that there's an urgent need to build social power before we move political power, or to create power on the level of society rather than power on the level of the state. So I will confess that my most modest hope for many of the left populist parties in the 2010s is mainly that they could facilitate forms of organization that had been rendered impossible by neoliberalism. And the classical example of this is, for example, Corbyn and McDonnell repealing anti-union legislation in Britain, because if unions in Britain want to call strikes now, they have a 50% turnout threshold, which means they spend an inordinate amount of time and resources on just getting people to vote. If they actually repeal this, this would greatly enhance the capacity for mobilization. Same goes for Bernie's plans to repeal Taft-Hartley or to institute sectoral bargaining. I think those are actually more interesting than the reindustrialization or the Green New Deal plans that have been touted in those movements, because those would have actually created an environment in which new forms of organization can flourish. And secondly, there are two dangers which I think we should highlight, for which left populists or leftists moving on from populism should pay very close attention to. The first is just the rise of a more redistributive right. And I know this is bound to be modest. It's never going to be anti-capitalist in any sense. But as you can see with something like the British Tories, you only have to move slightly to the left as a right-wing party to already make pretty impressive inroads with parts of the working class. And so this is coupled, I think, with the danger of remaining social democratic parties and green parties basically just becoming middle-class pressure groups or urban centrist pressure groups who cater to the needs of voters who are extremely pro-European Union, who have a set of incredibly liberal attitudes and a set of subjects, but who don't actually have any concrete working class support. So as the right becomes vaguely more redistributive, what is your counter move to that move? Secondly, we should be wary whether the COVID crisis or mainly the COVID confinement measures actually increase demobilization and make it even more difficult to rebuild the institutions for mass politics in the long term. This also includes the fact that there might be an obliteration of employment opportunities when the corona crash hits, in which workers still wield some kind of structural power over the economy. It's also dangerous, for example, that we're now witnessing a complete digitalization of the public sphere, in which we vote from home, in which we discuss from home, and in which everything happens on the internet, which is obviously not beneficial to the kind of mass politics we would like to see in the future. Now, to summarize these warnings and these advice points, I think first, maintain the agenda and foster new forms of organization if there is a capacity for you to get into power. counter the moves of a redistributive right if it arises, and also think about how an economy can be reorganized to make it COVID compatible without demobilizing your citizenry to such a degree that it becomes a passive population. And I think these are the only preconditions if we want to make mass politics viable again. And that is also, as I said, the hope I had for left populism, but maybe we have to think about different options for reviving mass politics today. But that's all I will say now. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you, Anton. I should mention that Anton's actually in Belgium at the moment, so it's a little bit past midnight for him. So I appreciate him giving such a depressing but still spirited presentation in form, depressing in content only. So I guess, well, first of all, a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. Please press like, press subscribe. Tomorrow we have a really good conversation with Leah Ippy on John Rawls and his strand of egalitarian liberalism, its relationship and its tensions with socialism. And Leah is great. Should be a good talk. So please press like and subscribe. So while questions are still coming in, I wanted to maybe prod you a bit. And I don't want to get this into just a question of taxonomy, but Bernie Sanders, he obviously obviously populism as a term is vague and slippery, because by definition it just refers to a rhetorical technique in which discourse in which you're separating the population into the people and the elite. You're creating this kind of polarization, but along lines that sometimes, I guess, cut across class a little bit more than the traditional Marxist approach. In the case of Sanders, though, he is, of course, talking about the virtuous people and the elite, but he's defining it in such a way that the people are working class people. He's using that language explicitly, and he's talking about the elite as millionaires and billionaires, so essentially the capitalist class. And essentially, to me, Sanders' rhetoric is just typical Marxian socialist rhetoric, just in the environment of a country where he has no party to rely on. He has no organized, mobilized workers' movement. So, in a sense, he's not a left populist, but he's just a socialist without a mass base who's trying to conjure a mass base. So, instead of left populist, he's just more pre-classical socialist. Does that make sense in any way? Or is this, I don't want to quibble just too much on language, but where do we draw the line? Whereas obviously Podemos, we could agree, is clearly a left populist formation.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very fair question, and it's good for you to kind of push back on the portrait I've been painting of all these actors as in some way uniquely populist. What I do think is that populism comes in degrees. So you can have actors who infuse more social content in the categories which they use to talk about their constituencies. And then you have actors who just talk about a people versus elite opposition that doesn't really have any social content to it. So if you construct a spectrum, as you say, you can say that Bernie obviously has a way more socially concrete way of talking about its people, while some variants in Podemos, like Errejón, would be comfortable almost getting rid of any social reference in how they talk about the people. But I do think that's a rhetorical aspect of populism, but I still think that organizationally populism also signifies something very specific. And that just means how do you cope with demobilization? And if you try to cope with demobilization, appeals to class become far more difficult because there is not yet any self-conception on behalf of many people that they actually belong to a class. So populism in some way offers a kind of inevitable organizational gateway into leading people into a class politics through a purely anti-elite frame. So again, if you see it as in terms of degrees, so people are a bit more populist or less populist than others, but also in terms of organizational questions, insofar as if you lack mass working class institutions, even in a corporatist sense. So even if you have mass working class institutions that are not militant, but at least have acquired a place in the state, populism kind of becomes an inevitable tactic in the sense that you have to refer to vaguer and broader categories in order for people to reorganize themselves to a certain degree.
Well, I think we around Jacobin thought broadly of populism as a tactic and a tactic worth pursuing in this unprecedented environment of a hollowed out civil society and defeated left. Whereas obviously some of our counterparts in Latin America and Spain and France tried to theorize a much deeper populism that was a turn away from some of the traditional class politics. And I wanted to get a little bit more into some of these debates in the 80s. You mentioned Laclau in passing, but this kind of turn, this tradition away from classes to people, interest to identities. Is this just merely a response to the defeat of the left and the traditional workers movement? So, in other words, are these theorists of left populists saying we've been defeated in battle, therefore we need to make this turn, or are they saying that capitalism has changed? If that distinction makes sense, was it a political defeat, or are they saying that the economic basis has been transformed, so we can't rebound from this defeat in the old way?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think it actually hints at a puzzle at the center of a lot of post-Marxist thinking and even populist thinking in the strand of Laclau and Mouffe, is that they're not very clear on why exactly we should leave behind class politics. The first argument they make is class politics was always wrong and exclusive, or it was always going to rely on too narrow a base to actually enact a form of transformation. Therefore, we should try the populist strategy. The other is, no, capitalism is changing in such a way that it's disaggregating these large industrial workforces and creating more liquid and more flexible workforces. If you want to do socialist politics in that context, you'll have to rely on the rhetoric of the people. And the issue of the confusion there is that they're not fully capable of telling us, is populism just a response to defeat, or is it actually left politics coming of its own? So in one case, it's just a rationalization of a defeat and trying to make the best of a worse world. In the other, it's basically trying to say, like, no, this is the proper way to do politics. It's just that in the 20th century, all these Marxists had a mistaken view of how you had to do politics. As their organizations are dwindling and turning away, we can finally discover the proper way to actually do politics. And I think this is also the kind of tragedy in a lot of these populist theorists, is that they have a difficulty in reckoning with the reality of demobilization. Or they see demobilization more as an opportunity than as a limit. So they say, oh, it's great that people are leaving all these parties. It's great that all these mass institutions are declining, because that opens them up to a different kind of project. But at the same time, that leaves you exclusively with a form of politics that mobilizes people, but it's not entirely clear what it mobilizes them for. So there's a kind of disjunction between politics and policy in there, insofar as once you have your politics straight and you construct a coalition, what kind of change is that coalition supposed to enforce on society? And as I said, this is a central puzzle in populist thinking.
And even if, let's say, Podemos was able to surpass, like they plan to, the Socialist Party, would they have actually been able to carry out a program without a mobilized, organized workers movement, without a disciplined party of some type? So it's not just that these parties are electorally underperforming. We've yet to see one of them carry out, even a basic program of reform. Um, I would say, though, I'm guessing these left populist theorists still see a role for class and class-based movements. They just conceptualize it as a movement of movements, in which you'll have a environmental movement, and you'll have a trade union movement, and you'll have a feminist movement, you'll have an anti-racist movement, and they'll all have their own autonomous structures, and they'll exist in this transient form, but they'll unite together in these big umbrellas. And to some extent, even the structure of more traditional new left parties like Blocko and these other parties in Europe seem to embrace this kind of movement, connecting party structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I mean, it's not that they're decreasing the priority of class, but it's more like putting class on the same level as all those other identities, or just considering class politics in itself a form of identity politics. But to return mainly to the question of these parties not just underperforming electorally, there's also just an argument to be made that in the 1980s and 1970s, we had a very well organized French working class, both in the Socialist Party and in the Communist Party, that actually got into government in the early 1980s, and which still had immense difficulty implementing its program, and which in the end just had to make an austerity turn. So
Yeah,
if we see it now, where we have a massively underorganized or even disorganized working class, and we have underperforming left populist parties, this means that obviously the bar has been lowered quite considerably, and we're fighting for far more minimal gains than anything that was possible in the 1980s. So I would urge some historical perspective on people and say, like, look, the mountain is incredibly steep. Like, it's a very, very long climb.
And obviously, one thing that the Mitterrand government ran into was European integration. There's a few questions, by the way, just about Brexit. But I think to clarify, even though you said that, I wouldn't get into the semantics of, he said that that the Corbyn movement was too left to fully embrace Brexit. I think he meant it somewhat pejoratively, because like Jacobin as a whole is broadly on the side of being very much against the process of European integration and very much sympathetic to pro-Brexit arguments, even if, in the actual referendum, I think there was an argument for Remain, even for those who were very hostile to the process of European integration. I think Corbyn was stuck in that space because he's from a much more traditional Benite left that fought Europe tooth and nail, but found it difficult to take part in a coalition that was led and driven by the right. And obviously, we can play these alternative history games about, what if Labour took a different stance? Maybe the character of that movement would have been different. But anyway, I was just responding to a few things in the chat. But I want to move on to a question that came up, which is, why has skepticism towards mediating institutions, trade unions, and party bureaucratic structures been such a defining feature of left populist movements?
Well, I think it's double, insofar as it's an ideological heritage of that main moment in the 1980s, in which a lot of new leftists felt that classical working class institutions had entered into a sort of compact both with the state and with the capitalist class, which meant that they were actually blocking a revolutionary transformation that would make possible a genuine transformative project. So I guess it's an ideological hangover of a certain new left that saw these classical mass institutions as somehow blackmailed and bought out. And that legacy lives on in what you could call a slight anti-organizational bias in some contemporary left populist thinkers and politicians. But on the second hand, the simpler explanation is just, well, it's slightly making a virtue out of necessity. It's just a product of a certain environment, and it seeks to just do anything within that environment that is slightly possible, in the sense that it is just immensely difficult to reorganize the current service economies that Europe has. There is just not the industrial base to build those classical mass working class institutions. So it's not that they have a strong ideological bias towards organizations. It's just like, wow, it's immensely difficult to rebuild organizations today. So there is slight ideology, but I think the majority of it is just, as Marx said, men make their own history, but they don't make it in circumstances of their own choosing.
And obviously, the hollowing out of civil society isn't a problem just limited to the left. This is a problem in our churches. Or other civic networks are all on decline. The only thing is, the right is better able to adapt to this situation because their politics don't require the level of organization and mass energy that our politics requires. It's easier to organize capitalists in the interest of capitalism than it is to organize workers and their class interests within the capitalist system. So there's another question. Yep, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I think we really need to highlight just how profound the crisis is on the right as well. So Christian democratic parties all across the continent are suffering tremendously from challengers, mainly on the populist right. They are hemorrhaging members. They find it ever more difficult to legitimate their function. So as you say, this anti-organizational tendency is not just something that's afflicting the left, it's definitely also afflicting the right. And the right is going through, as you said, its own existential crisis. As you said, they just find it easier because they have a systemic bias in the current settlement. So they have a lower success requirement.
Right. So I'm going to get to some of these questions about the particular nature of populism in Latin America. But let me read another question before that, which is, how do you think the digitization of the public sphere can be combated if it needs to be? Is there any literature on that question?
I think the easiest response is just to log off, but that is very bad advice because it would imply a very intense behavioral change for me myself. I just think that the most important way of fighting the digitalization is to stop telling ourselves fairy tales about digital politics. That means you can do a lot with the internet. You can achieve very interesting results with it. You can grow an intellectual culture on the internet, but is no substitute for mass organization. And you can't actually do proper strikes via the internet. So this is something we should just keep in mind. It's not so much about fighting digitalization, but not confusing digitalization for something that it is clearly not.
So someone in the chat, by the way, mentions Northern Discomfort by John Trickett and Ian Lavery, which is obviously it came out last year. It kind of, or maybe it actually fully was released this year. I saw a draft
Mhm.
last year, and these are two northern MPs in the UK that really saw what was coming with some of the December results and Labour's kind of mistaken pivot to Remain voters in the south of England. What that happened, but the title Northern Discomfort is a kind of a pun on that old Fabian socialist booklet, Southern Discomfort, which obviously, a turn that in some of continental Europe took the turn of a post-Marxist turn towards various forms of populism. In the UK context, you could say that a lot of those same feelings of this abandonment of the organized working class as an agent of change um, took the form of a turn towards a hollowed out third way social democratic politics. Would you say that there was kind of some sort of parallel between the two, even if today we see populism as an alternative to the hollowed out third way or neoliberalized social democratic parties? They kind of had some similar origins, or is that too much of a stretch?
No, I think I definitely would accept a version of that argument. I think you have to phrase it carefully insofar as Laclau and Mouffe and other populist thinkers were very stern critics of the third way in the 1990s, in that they saw it as a neutralization and almost a defanging of radical politics, which obviously had to be combated. But there's a very interesting moment in the early 1990s when you have figures such as Stuart Hall, Mouffe, and Laclau, who actually express a very cautious optimism about Blair, because they see Blair as a figure who can actually transition Labour out of an old Bennite or workerist straitjacket, which is holding it back and stopping it from acquiring a bigger electoral coalition. So I think we need to keep in mind that there was always a populist element to Blairism, but also to the third way in general, insofar as you're cutting ties with all these civil society institutions, as you're letting go of your connection to unions, and as you're turning more and more to PR, the language of the people just becomes a natural resource for you. And I think we shouldn't remember that one of Blair's most famous speeches he gave after the death of Princess Diana was precisely about her being a people's princess. And the right-wing press was all about the fact that, well, we have a people's everything now. We have a people's chancellor. We have a people's prime minister. We have a people's princess. And so there was a deep populist dimension to Blair, which was not necessarily the kind of populism that Laclau and Mouffe would have liked to have seen, but it did express a similar desire to move beyond what you could call worker-centric or workerist politics in the 1980s. So Blair buried the left, but not in the right way.
Yeah, and I think that there was a certain type of workerist politics you could actually use that word that way because uh, you know in most of the world today, when we talk about working class politics, Marxists just assume that we're talking about people who have to work for a living. But at various points in, let's say, the UK left's political tradition, a worker was more narrowly defined to just a layer of the manual working class. So if you want to take the best possible fate reading of work like Hobsbawm's forward march of labor halted. It's asking many good questions about whether this approach can yield a coalition. But there's a difference between building a majoritarian working class led coalition that is better able to incorporate middling stratas and
Mhm.
professionals and whatnot, and letting those middling stratas take over the Workers'
Yeah,
Party, which is what happened with Blairism. But from afar, when it's developing, it's kind of not it's not exactly clear who's leading who. Though
yeah.
obviously other thinkers were far more incisive, like Ralph Miliband and others, kind of saw it from the beginning. But I want to turn to Latin America because obviously populism, to the extent it's most coherently associated with a tradition in power, it's associated with Latin America and in particular Peronism. So I'm wondering whether you could describe the dynamics of Latin American populism, and in particular whether we could classify this new wave of pink tide leaders, in particular, let's say Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales and others within the populist tradition, and whether, I guess, if we do accept that they're both parts of the populist tradition, whether we have to draw a line between classical populism of Peron, which was very corporatist, and the populism of Hugo Chavez and others, which is a populism that's based around class struggle. And like Rene Rojas touched on this a little bit in his talk earlier in the week, which everyone should check out and stay at home, um, between a type of populism that is just essentially taking left politics and using it for an environment where the working class is so stuck in the informal economy and so disorganized that this is the rhetoric and appeal of class, but in no way is it aiming at some sort of corporatist class compromise.
Yeah, so I definitely think there's an argument to be made about the continuity between European left populism and the types of pink tide populism that preceded it in the 2000s. So in Spain, for example, there's a very prominent discourse of what they call the Latino Americanization of Spanish politics, where a lot of the categories that seemingly only pertain to Latin American context now seem ever more accurate in a Spanish context, which partly, of course, has to do because some of these left popular figures also maintain ties with pink tide governments in the 2000s, and therefore in the public eye were associated with them. But I do think there are continuities, but there are also some slight differences. Insofar as classical Peronist populism in the 20th century obviously didn't arise in the same context of demobilization. In fact, Peronism relied on a highly organized, mainly industrial working class. I didn't necessarily capture the petit bourgeoisie, but which then shepherded that working class into a corporatist settlement. So it's definitely a form of populism insofar as it relies on a non-class-based coalition. So it doesn't center its own politics around class. It's people-centric insofar as the concept of a people is quite important to it. It's anti-elitist, but it doesn't have the same kind of anti-organizational issues that you see popping up in a lot of European contexts. And I think you can make a similar claim about Chavez, although Chavez, as you say, faces more disorganization, faces mainly an informal labor force that isn't structured in these mass industrial collectivities, but at the same time tries to impose some kind of unity on it through a very leader-centric strategy. So I think the people-centrism, the leader-centrism, but not necessarily the organizational element, connect Latin American populism to European populist variants.
This is a broad stroke way to think about it, but if you imagine a lot of the early leaders of the workers' movement or the leaders of the first social democratic governments, we didn't really have these firebrands take power. Often they were bookish intellectuals or people who had some sort of trade union background.
Mhm.
Like I'm thinking of like Leon Blum and others. Like this kind of like leaders are the people who took power from the left, in part because they were just products of parties and
Mhm.
institutions, and they didn't rely on their own charisma or on the things that, let's say, a presidential election or presidential
Mhm.
system would um, demand today. Um, so I think that maybe a good place to end would be to go back to a question about where we go, further, further from here. So, for one, what do we assess of the left populist moment? Is it dead? Is it essentially? Um, do we just keep trying? Is it just country by country? Um, And I guess the second thing is, when we think about the left populist arc, should we think of it as just a way to jumpstart a workers' movement? And if that's the way we think about it, what are some of the concrete things that a movement like, let's say, the early Podemos that has all this energy can do to institutionalize in such a way that it carries out class struggle even when times are bad and you might lose an election or two? Or going back to Syriza, which we haven't really touched on, what can these new insurgent forces do to, in other words, survive? Because in many ways, it's a wonder that these social democratic parties still exist, and in part that's because they have structures and institutions and all sorts of things. Like, ironically, for those of you organizing in Germany, I'm sure you hate the SPD, and I'm sure they're a barrier to the success of the far left and in Germany. But in a weird way, we're the victims of our own success, because a party that was founded by the German workers movement in the its original roots date back to the 1870s, 1880s, is still around and still stable, while every single other party has disappeared. So I want to leave with that question, or just anything you want to say about what some of our tactical takeaways from recent history of left populism, let's say particularly in Europe, because things get thorny in the US context.
Yeah. No, I think I wouldn't call the left populist moment, sorry, fully over, or left populism dead as a formation. But I do think it's losing its coherence, and there are very profound, almost existential questions on what its next direction and step will be. So we obviously have to await the results of upcoming elections. Certainly for Mélenchon, it's not clear that Macron, for example, is as safe in his position as he is now. And there might still be attempts to resuscitate that left populist coalition that might be vaguely successful. It's just that there's no more a coherent wave in which a left populist strategy was used almost uniformly across contexts. But at the same time, what I mentioned also with Mélenchon is there's a clear electoral bias, or what you could call an electoralism, in some of these movements, insofar as they equate getting into power purely with getting into government. And one of the points Ralph Miliband made in the 1980s about the Labour Party, which kind of etiolates and shows its weaknesses, is that if you compare the Labour Party to something like the Italian Communist Party, which in the post-war period barely had any time in government, who was never able to actually get into a position of power, but which had such a massive civil society infrastructure and power structure that it was able to exercise an enormous amount of, yeah, you could call it hegemony, which actually had a very profound effect on policy as well. While the Labour Party was in government for quite a long time in the post-war period, but didn't have the same kind of counterweight as the PCI did, and actually just ended up in positions of power where they either obeyed IMF dictate, or they just had to govern in the interests of capital against their best intentions. So in that sense, and this is also important for the Labour Party, it's better to lose an election but maintain your solid, loyal base, rather than just chase very ephemeral and mainly satisfying victories, but which won't actually give you a sustainable or durable coalition in which you can go into the future. And I think one of the dangers of left populism, it does encourage this kind of electoralist reflex where anything we do, we have to get into power, rather than asking, okay, how do we think about this long term, and how do we become more like the Italian Communist Party rather than a Labour Party that just ends up as, well, a managerial faction that just wants to govern a bit more in favor of workers.
Yeah, I mean, the bare minimum, our goal is to organize the working class, to articulate class interests, and to carry out a pro working class program. And that should be, no matter how revolutionary you are or how reformist you are, that's the basis that unites left wing politics. And often I feel like we're just skipping to the last step. And if you did manage to get Corbyn into power, but you do so by electing a lot of really bad MPs and ending into a weak minority government with Lib Dem support, you're not going to be able to carry out your program. Um, and probably it's better than the defeat that happened, but just barely. And it's
Yeah.
sometimes better to be in opposition. And we'll see the outcome of this coalition with in Spain. But obviously, a lot of us remember, or at least tangentially around the left, when Rifondazione was a real source of inspiration in um, in Europe. And obviously, Rifondazione, the Italian kind of refounded Communist Party, completely declined after they entered into a coalition with Prodi. But in any case, that gave us a lot to chew on. I really do. There's two versions of Anton's articles you should read. You could read the kind of pop breezy version before dinner in Jacobin. But if you really have time, please do take a look at his co-written article in the last edition of Catalyst. It's really worth your time. There's lots of footnotes that can kind of take you down the rabbit hole of getting into this important topic. But thank you so much for staying up, Anton. I know it's past 1 a.m. there, so I
No worries.
appreciate it. And yeah, take care. Hopefully, see you soon.
See you soon. Thanks. Thank you.